This paper has one particular goal, which is to take the research, the different work that's already been done, the legislative landscapes, both in the US and abroad, and try to recommend a better way forward, a safer, more usable internet for kids and adults that preserves the benefits like expression, community, while dealing with some of the harms that we've been talking about all day today. So why does this matter? Well, children spend much of their lives online, like we do, but the digital world isn't built for them. It frankly isn't built for us. So as we see the constant headlines about cyberbullying, predators, addictive design, we also know that kids are using the internet to learn, to have friendships, to think creatively and discover more about themselves. So the challenge here is the balance, which is how do we address the harms that we're seeing while protecting children's privacy, their rights, and their ability to participate fully online? So we make a sort of central core argument, which is this concept we think of as safety by design. So first and foremost, right now, a lot of the conversation puts burdens on either parents or children. The burden on children is to not let them access either certain platforms or certain content, while the burden on parents is usually more parental controls, more surveillance, more monitoring. We think neither of those approaches work, and that instead, companies need to be incentivized to create platforms that are safe by default. So this means anticipating risks and trying to prevent them, rather than relying on children and their parents to navigate unsafe spaces and create workarounds. So as I've mentioned, there are benefits and risks to the internet, and we need to be clear-eyed about both. And we need to be clear-eyed about both. And unfortunately, oftentimes when you're using the internet, you experience the risks and the benefits at the same time. The duality is what makes the policy making so challenging. So our current regulatory landscape, very, very quickly, is in Europe, we have GDPR and the Digital Services Act having some design-like requirements, some privacy requirements, and some content requirements. The UK's Online Safety Act just went into effect, and I think there's been a lot of writing about it, specifically with respect to its age assurance requirements and whether or not those are working. And there are more than 130 countries with some sort of data protection framework specifically for children. In the US, as you mentioned, COPPA is still currently the only law that addresses this on point. There are lots of other proposals which have been talked about. But the states have been moving quickly, taking sort of banning approaches, increased parental surveillance, more age assurance, and design requirements, and sometimes a mix of all four of those ideas. But as you all know, most of these laws are currently under litigation or waiting for litigation to sort themselves out so we can understand how this relates to our First Amendment jurisprudence and our rights to freely express and speak. So given these difficult tensions and given the sort of uncertainty we're seeing at the federal level of what this looks like, we have some principles that we're using to guide us when we think about child safety and the regulatory proposals. So first and foremost, the internet can enrich childhood, and we can design an internet that can be enriching for children. Two, we must rely on safe product design and safe products rather than focusing on some sort of consent or parental consent mechanism. Third, it's empowering youths to make better decisions and to give them better tools to control their experiences. Four is having a risk-based approach to target the worst harms. Five is ensuring meaningful enforcement. Six, avoiding blanket bans on access or content. And seven, supporting ongoing research and transparency into this space. As new features are added, as new technology is developed, it will have differing effects on their users. So all of these principles taken together are our attempt to center the rights of children and their access to the internet while holding corporations and tech companies accountable for the products that they put out. So there's a lot of policy considerations to think of before you can even start to talk about regulation. So there are some basic structural questions that we flagged. So who counts as a child? Should platforms be verifying ages? What counts as sufficient age insurance? Knowledge standards, etc. As a highlight, who counts as a child? Very glibly, anyone under the age of 18. But more importantly, thinking about regulation and thinking about how to use our policymaking knowledge to create products that create a glide path for children into their teens, into the young adulthood. How do we incentivize the creation of tools that make it easier to be a kid online? Second, should platforms be required to verify age? No. We think age assurance tech is useful in very limited circumstances, like for limiting access to features that have high risk, like going live on TikTok or entering unmoderated voice chats in a multiplayer massive MMORPG. So, but again, these are tied to specifically high-risk features that have been identified and can be specifically linked to the harms that we're trying to prevent. Age assurance should not be a gateway to the internet, to social media, to content generally. So, what counts as sufficient age assurance? We didn't come out with a specific technology in mind, but we do have some thoughts. First and foremost, it must be private and it must be secure. We're not trying to create an identity system. We're trying to understand if you are over or under a certain age. So, in order to use those kinds of technologies, it has to clear that bar first. And then understanding how accurate and in what ways a system may be inaccurate as it applies to those features, and whether or not those inaccuracies will cause meaningful impact to adults using those features. Again, unfortunately, I have to say this is very fact-specific, but we take a risk-based approach in if we're going to cut off access. And finally, how do you know if someone's a child if I can't collect their information, if I'm not supposed to be identifying every user? Well, we do not support a change to the knowledge standard as it currently exists under COPPA. We do think one thing that makes sense is if a platform is engaging in targeted advertising and that targeted advertising puts people into categories by age, you probably have a pretty good idea if you have children on your platform. These sorts of structural considerations first need to be addressed before you can go on into the regulatory frameworks about what companies are or not required to do, but this is how we've answered those questions. So beyond these sort of structural considerations, we've talked about certain policy avenues that we're concerned about going down too far. So I've talked at length, and it goes at length in the paper, about blanket bans on access or content. These do not work. They have significant implications for First Amendment freedoms, and they do not make experiences meaningfully safer. We also have a perspective that children's rights should drive legislation rather than parental rights. We're creating an environment that works for children, not one that is perfectly suited to how parents would like their children to experience the world. We think this distinction is important given the political context. I think Shay talked about it quite a lot this morning, and one that is useful to remember in this. Finally, notice and consent frameworks. Let's get rid of them. We've been saying this in the privacy world for years. It's not going to work in the safety space. We can't keep proposing, well, if you consent to it, it's fine. And finally, or not finally, regulating algorithms needs to be done with caution and care. Again, because we're worried about effects on content, blanket bans on personalized algorithms probably don't work, but focusing more on user choice and control may be a better avenue. And finally, we think prioritizing design and protected defaults rather than trying to designate what is and is not harmful content or what applications children should or should not be using is a much better policy framework to go down. So we have a couple different concrete policy proposals that we recommend. First and foremost is default privacy and safety settings. Default settings are great, and Pam has talked about this a lot, and so has many other researchers. If you turn something on for people, they tend not to turn it off. And it also gives parents and children the ability to change their settings if they're not serving them. So another thing, tools to reduce unwanted interactions or interactions with unknown or unwanted accounts or content. This has been seen across multiple different points of research. I think specifically of CBT has done quite a lot about how teenagers in particular use blocking and muting functions. But these kind of functions that allow you to control who you're interacting with are incredibly important and probably should be regulatorily required for platforms. Another thing we've been thinking about is what does a mandatory wellness break in continuous content apps look like? Again, this is not banning, this is not even saying it must be turned off from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It is what is a long enough break that encourages a user to maybe stop and do something else if they want to. As I mentioned before, age assurance for high-risk features if there is no other practical policy solution for the harms we're worried about occurring. And then finally, researcher access to platform data. In doing this report, we were heavily reliant on the current state of research that is being done across the country about how teens and children use platforms. This is the only way to make policy, to do policy making that serves the end user and stays relevant to the harms that we're trying to prevent. So, what should the path forward look like? Or where do we go from here? So, a couple of things that I am reiterating again and again. We need to protect kids online while not cutting off their access to the internet or their ability to express themselves. We also need to put the responsibility on corporations to build privacy and safety into their products by default. Again, the goal is a safer, healthier internet for kids and hopefully by default, all users. I appreciate you all taking the time and indulging in this very, very quick overview of the paper. I highly recommend you read it because it is expressed much more eloquently in writing than I can speak. And we also have, Morgan has been, we also have a companion blog post about age assurance in this new age now that we have the UK Online Safety Act, Mississippi, and others, and what that means about how we think about age assurance and when it needs to be used. So, all that being said, Public Knowledge has a bit of a tradition when we put out a white paper on a sort of new topic for us, which is that we invite experts from the field to come and talk about it and interrogate it a little bit. So I'd love for my panelists to come up.
Unlike other panels, what I will ask you all to do is take 5 minutes to both introduce yourself and also give your first impressions of this paper. What you agreed with, what was interesting, what you disagreed with, and I'm hoping this will start the framework for a larger discussion. I also want to flag for the room, unlike the other panels, later in this panel I'll be opening up for questions both for myself and the other panelists, so if there's things of interest that you want to raise, start thinking of them now. But I will just go from right to left, so I guess I'm starting with Amelia.
Okay, I was hoping you'd start that way.
I can pick on Sydney if you'd rather.
Hello everyone, I'm Amelia Vance. I've been working in child and student privacy for almost 13 years now, and currently run a nonprofit, the Public Interest Privacy Center. My favorite thing is to provide people with resources and information as needed so we don't remake the wheel. And I will say one of the things I love about this paper is it builds on the really smart things that people have been deciding, the design experts, the child development experts, the privacy experts, the free speech experts. It's incredibly thoughtful and incredibly well done. And that matters because we have way too many legislative proposals right now that created language out of somebody's head, which of course is always dangerous because there are always flaws in that. And unfortunately, legislative systems aren't set up like this panel where you have broad discussion and make sure that people are there to give feedback and to try and poke holes, whatever it is. It is whoever is paying attention gives feedback, and then everybody else lives with the consequences, for better or worse. So really, really appreciated. The paper was thrilled when you told me you were pulling it together, and very excited to see it. So it was difficult for me to have a lot of substantive feedback other than that, but there were a couple things. First of all, and I know this was absolutely intentional, I think it needed to be framed at the state level, or at least incorporating the state level. The way that federal policy has worked in this space is by almost a poll, or what gets the most attention at the state level. And so when we want a federal policy to work, part of the way to get people to advocate for it, to push for it, is where most of the people in this room are probably not paying attention, which is all of the states and the 2-month-long state legislative sessions that are coming up very soon. And so just from a perspective of me wanting to see this at the federal level, having the state version on that side for me is really important because it's what people will point to. And it's how you actually get people, your state has done this. Folks have looked at that. I was surprised, and totally could have missed it, but I was surprised there wasn't more of a mention other than sort of a cursory one of the fact that so many of the underlying harms are based on flat-out deception from companies, and that despite the fact that that is illegal and that it has been enforced against, there's obviously something more that has to happen. For example, for anyone who looked this morning in the Washington Post, apparently Facebook decided the best way to not find out about kids being harassed in virtual space was to not have researchers put that in writing and to ignore the findings of that research, which there's a hearing tomorrow for anyone who didn't know in Congress. So this is one of the things that I've been trying to figure out. I don't know if the answer is some sort of supersized, unfair, deceptive practices piece, but it feels like there needs to be something, because routinely, again and again, I was reading Broken Code by the Wall Street Journal reporter who's done the Facebook files more broadly, and you see again and again, we have decided to tell our users this is safe. We have decided to tell our users that we are taking these protections, and it turns out none of those protections were actually happening. None. And so I think trying to deal with that aspect, because so many of the things that are happening right now are legal, what do we do with that? The only other things, I'm a big fan of youth empowerment, in part because I know as I was growing up and the internet was all dial-up and such, it was so easy for me and for my brother to get into the computer that was in the living room and do whatever. My parents changed the password. My brother reset the entire Windows system. He had no technical knowledge. He still looks very bad at it. It doesn't doesn't work. People are going to go around things. We've seen with the Online Safety Act implementation that people are going to darker corners of the internet that are not regulated. And so I love the original intention of the UK's age-appropriate design code, which was around what if kids didn't have to lie to be on the internet? What if what they were provided by default was okay, and they could say, I'm under 13, I'm under 17, and have their experience, well, allow them to experience the website. There should be some allowance for that, because I don't know about anyone else, but there's a lot of people who have expressed here and elsewhere that they want to be able to turn off, to filter certain words from their feed, etc. And people say that's childproofing the internet, but I've been struck for the longest time about research where it's a lot less controversial to childproof the internet when you think about the fact that 1 in 3 people on the internet are under 18. And so looking at choices there will balance in these equities, which maybe involves just giving people the option to say, I'm younger, please stop serving me with targeted ads, would be lovely. Yeah, those are good things.
Thank you. Ariel, I turn to you.
Sure. Hi, I'm Ariel Fox-Johnson. Wear a number of hats in the privacy and kids tech policy space. I'm here today in my capacity as Senior Advisor to Common Sense Media on data privacy. Issues I focus on for Common Sense include data privacy and age assurance. So happy to talk about the age assurance paper. Like Amelia, largely positive feedback. I think there's a lot of areas of agreement here between common sense and public knowledge. I think it's possible for you to have age assurance that does not in and of itself regulate speech, that's focused on providing higher privacy protections or product design-based improvements. I agree that it would be amazing to just have a comprehensive privacy law for everyone, and then we would not need to do age assurance. I think Eric Goldman was saying this, and I don't agree with Eric Goldman on a lot of stuff. But yeah, that would be great. Let's just do that. But I think so for things that there may be some daylight or I have some questions about, one was about algorithms. And I think it's unclear if algorithms are protected by the First Amendment. I think that's kind of an open question in the courts right now. While I agree it may not matter if it's like a human or an algorithm that causes the harm to a user or to a child, I think right now with humans you have more responsibility, and we're seeing outside of the kids space, like often with the algorithms, companies are claiming like they don't know what's going on or other protections. On the concept of algorithms, I think AI chatbots, and specifically AI companion chatbots that have come up already today, here and in the news, are a big thing to think about. When I'm talking about AI companions, I'm talking about AI being used for social relationships, and that's intended to build an emotional connection with its user. You can see how these might be particularly problematic for young people and also attractive for young people. I think someone already mentioned Common Sense research showing over 70% of teens have used AI companions, over 50% are frequent users of AI companions, and 1/3 of teens prefer these to real humans. I think in part studies have shown like the AI companion is always there. They're never too busy. They will generally, if you train them to or ask them to, agree with you and support you, and they will not disagree with you or question you. And you will always be the most important thing to them, things like that. It doesn't really teach kids great skills for future human interaction. So I'm curious, acknowledge that the AI is not really specifically in this paper, but like where on the risk spectrum you would put them, medium risk or high risk, I don't know, we can talk about that. hopefully not low risk, but maybe, common sense view is that AI companions are not appropriate for kids under 18. AI should not be used for companionship or for sort of mental health services for kids under 18. And it's necessary to have some reasonable age assurance to protect on things like that. I think common sense would put AI companions into the high risk category. Also, we would put virtual horizon worlds, meta reality into high risk. I think a lot of social media might fall into high risk, so that's a place I would push back a bit on.
Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt Lane, Senior Policy Counsel at Effective the Future. We are a nonprofit that advocates across a number of issues at the intersection of human rights and technology. There are two things that are pretty core to our identity that kind of shape my comments today. The first is that we do our best to center marginalized voices in our advocacy, both learning from them and trying to speak for them. And in that way, I think it's very important that we consider not just kids from families where they have positive relationships with their parents, but also kids that have adversarial relationships with their parents, and sort of have that instruct a lot of how we look at these issues. The other thing that's core to our identity is the enabling the ability to create tech for good. We're a small organization, yet we have 2 programmers on staff. We build a lot of tools that help people participate in sort of government and other things. We hear a lot from that community of largely small, open source, often nonprofit technology companies that are trying to offer alternatives, and we think that's great. And so, as part of that, I think that we read this paper, or at least I read this paper, and that I found a lot that I agree with. I think that it's important to acknowledge the positives of online communities. I know a lot of research around this is sort of a mixed bag, but we consistently find evidence that LGBTQ communities and LGBTQ youth have more positive experiences. That seems to be maybe correlated with the fact that they also seem to work harder to shape their online communities and spaces. Probably because they need that outlet more. We are also a big fan of sort of focusing on design tools, especially ones that empower users to shape their own online experience and how the platforms interact with them. I think that generally we are also big fans of private rights of action, just because you can't really rely on the administration to sort of catch or promote all of these cases. And I would caveat that in some instances, if it's too expansive, it could allow for a lawfare for a lot of these sort of culture warriors to shape online experiences through lawsuits, and I have some anxieties around that. And I think we are very much in agreement with the idea of focusing on privacy as an easy way of solving or alleviating a lot of the problems we find online, not collecting the data that is necessary to sort of put people in these negative feedback loops. Where we break, I think, is that we draw harder lines just based on how we assess risks. And the 2 main areas that happens are age verification and sort of content restrictions. So when it comes to age verification, there's significant privacy, security, speech, and competition issues that are all implicated in that. Just to go through them real quick, privacy, linking your identity to certain things, especially, things that are considered vice or embarrassing online, security, and that a lot of these databases become honeypots for bad actors, speech, and that when you lose the ability to speak anonymously online, you often self-regulate what you're allowed to say, or you allow yourself to say. And competition is the big one that we've been seeing a lot lately, around age verification and then implementation of the UK Online Safety Act and a few other state laws. Blue Sky is no longer available in Mississippi because they can't comply with that. under their model. We saw a lot of issues, Newgrounds, which I didn't even know existed anymore. Had a really interesting blog post where they're being transparent about their struggles with complying with age verification laws in the UK. I think that, a lot of the evidence shows that age verification can be very expensive, it can be ineffective, like when we saw people figuring out that you can use the Death Stranding 2 photo mode, I think, to bypass a lot of age verification around facial recognition. And the other sort of big problem with age verification, this is something I think again that was brought up by Eric Goldman, but other professors are using this term as segregate and suppress. And this is an issue that we're really worried about in that I think that it's a bit nebulous what kids should not be allowed to see or interact with. And, obviously worker-led organization, one of our directors is trans. A lot of this kind of content seems to be looped into what we are suppressing kids from being able to interact with. We've seen proposed state legislation that explicitly calls out queer content as being adult and therefore not available for kids. And the other thing that sort of is tied up in our feeling or views of age verification is that a lot of these harms happen to adults too. I mean, we see just as many instances of adults getting negatively impacted by their online experience, going down rabbit holes, and in a lot of ways, unfortunately, those sort of negative ideas and other things can impact their family life too, like depending on what sort of internet you get involved in. You could see a lot of adults no longer, treating their kids who are different positively based on what they've seen in some dark corners of the internet. And I'll try to go a little bit faster, but just when it goes to content restrictions, we draw hard lines for similar reasons. The kinds of content that a lot of our communities rely on are the kinds of content that are usually attempted to be restricted either nationally or internationally. And of course, the rest of the world looks to the United States when it comes to pretty much everything. I want to just briefly mention how some of this came out in a case called CCI versus Paxton. I thought the judge's description of the nuances of content moderation was interesting in that, while it seems to be common sense to try to restrict people from pro-suicide content, there have also been political debates around physician-assisted suicide for decades now. I remember the debate when I was in high school. And, the judge there said that the net result of this law, which was similar to the Online Safety Act within the UK and the United States, that it would prohibit minors from participating in the democratic exchange of views online. I think that it's really important to remember that content restrictions, or just the content moderation in general, is just incredibly messy and adversarial. Like as soon as you start down that road, you can never stop. You always have to be, if it's the word kill you're banning, then all of a sudden people are going to say unalive. Like, if you talk to any content moderator, they will tell you it is a non-stop process of cat and mouse, of bad actors, figuring out what they're doing, how they're changing, reacting to the new systems, adapting your systems, adapting your models. And I think it's really important to remember that, it's very messy and it's very hard when it comes to speech.
Thank you. Sydney, let's round us out.
They said everything. Hi, my name is Sydney Saubestre. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Open Technology Institute, which I just wrote down because I should have memorized this by now, but I've only worked there for 2 years. Works at the intersection of technology and policy to ensure every community has access to benefits of digital technology and is protected from harms. That's what OTI does. What I do is I work on data use and privacy. And in a past life, I worked on public health initiatives that were mostly focused on improving the offline experiences of youth. And that's where a lot of might come from this. I really love the framing of the paper. I think you guys did an excellent job of balancing the difficulty of how do you improve the internet for everyone, or how do you improve technologies for everyone, while also being realistic about some of the harms that it causes. I often joke, but it's not a joke to people, that the reason I got into tech policy is because my brain doesn't work in black and white, and tech policy is all gray. So I feel like you captured that really well. The main points of agreements, both from myself and then also representing OTI and views, is that the safety and security by design should be built into all technology, that better features should be universal, they should not just be for kids. I loved what Amelia said around which is reflected in the paper as well, around the fact that agency and choice is really important. There's no reason why we can't have friction, there's no reason why people shouldn't have more control over what they see online, other than, which is also captured very well, is that the responsibility has been shifted to the users. It's no longer with the companies that are actually providing this technology, and we need to have some reforms around this systemic responsibility. I think all that's very well done. Some of the slight quibbles is I always think about the devil's in the details with all of this. And so, as I mentioned, I used to work with youth directly. So for a long time, I worked on an initiative to reform foster care for youth who had experienced commercial sexual exploitation. And so a lot of times when I think about these topics, I think that there's a very specific child or young person who a lot of people have in mind, which is not necessarily around public knowledge, but just generally. And that is someone who comes from a relatively affluent background where they have a lot of access to this technology. They have offline alternatives to using this technology. And that was not the kids I worked with. So the kids I worked with were kids who did not have cell phone numbers. Social media was a lifeline for them. If they had their phone taken away from them, if they left their placement, social media was how they contacted their social workers, and it was the way in which they essentially stayed in touch with people who were important to them. So that's a lot of when I think about what the policy recommendations are and I think about harm, I really try to center, as Matt said, who are the kind of vulnerable users in this space. All kids are vulnerable, but there are different types of harms that apply to different types of people. So with that in mind, the three broad areas that I think that we could discuss in more detail, which I'm excited to do, is we need more data and we need more research to really understand what the harms are here. I think before we roll out a lot of these initiatives, what I would love to see in an ideal world, not even to protect for all policies ever, is that we figure out what the evidence tells us before we start enacting legislation. Maybe that's a pipe dream, I don't know. But you know what, it's good to keep something positive in mind when we're doing all of this work. And so I think that with a lot of these, not in the paper specifically, but in the world that we live in, people have prior assumptions around what is and what isn't harmful, and what isn't bad for people generally. I did an analysis not too long ago that was looking at some longitudinal data that was trying to, there was a question that was asked in a survey that's asked every 2 years, but it was the first time they asked about social media. And social media was linked to higher rates of mental health, worse mental health outcomes. Predictably, everyone then jumped on that as social media causes poor mental health outcomes. So I did an analysis looking at the different data, and when you actually, it was relatively simple, but when you start to hold the different parameters and you start to look at what are the demographics, what are some of the offline experiences that people are having, when you look at that, the correlation completely falls apart. There is no correlation, and where there might be a little bit more for some specific groups. So for example, young girls do tend to have worse mental health outcomes when they use a higher amount of social media, whether or not that's because they're spending more time online to cope with their existence or whether or not that's causing it, that's the part where I feel like we just need more information. I'm not denying that it might. I always say this a little sheepishly, but I'm not on social media for my own personal reasons. So I'm not saying that social media is necessarily good, but I just think that before we enact broad policies, we need to understand what harms are being done. So that's one. And then the next one that I think I really love the way that you approach this in terms of breaking down the potential risks. I think that the way you guys attach some of those risks is very well done. I also think that there's a world in which people will capitulate on the idea that something is high risk and will then use it to cut off access to various platforms or content, and that's something that I don't think most of us in this group want. So for example, I think broadly OTI agrees that age verification for adult content is something that we should all align on. How we do that is what we're still debating, but that's something that we can align on. But the idea, and this is again from examples of work I've done, but the idea that we should restrict potentially live streaming for people who are talking about specific types of content like that, that's something where if someone were using, it was Snapchat at the time, I guess TikTok now, but using TikTok Live to talk about an experience that they had with, abuse that they experience related to their sexual orientation, would that be something that we would ban because it would be considered high risk? And what if there are people who are following that information or following that content but don't actually want to follow the account because they don't want to be linked to that account? So these are all the things that, like, again, not a reason not to do things, but I just think that we need to consider. And then the final point is the always point that, sorry, because I work on privacy, which is that some of the suggested interventions, well, really important, also seem hard to do in a privacy protective way within the reality of the world that we live in. So I really like the idea that there needs to be more researcher access to data. I also agree with Amelia and with the paper generally that we shouldn't trust these companies to self-police themselves. It has never worked. And so I actually think that we should go further with the researcher access to data. And while synthetic data can be really helpful, and it's still, you still don't know all of the parameters, and you still have to have some trust to providing you with data that's helpful. So we could use things like differential privacy or a tiered researcher access to really assess what the impacts are. And I think that also should be done before the policy and actions are completed. So that would be really important. But then I also think on the other side, so for example, Sara, who works with me at OTI, is here and knows more about age verification than I do, so please go talk to her instead of me on that specific front. Wrote a great brief on zero knowledge proof and how we can use zero knowledge proof to solve some of the privacy issues with age verification. But the problem is, as she wrote, is that the ecosystem for implementation in the US is just not there yet. And so again, that's not a reason not to do it, but it's just something to be cautious of. And then the final thing I'll say just in conclusion, and this is again more from general point, and not necessarily in response to, but just I like the framing, and so we'll bring this up again because I hope we can talk about it more in the panel. I think that we have as a society, this was writing a piece recently, and they were really focused on the fact that the audience for the piece, it was about youth mental health, and that the audience for the piece were the parents. And so I was talking to the parents and not the kids because that's who reads the paper. That being said, I actually think that we need to be talking to the kids, and that online and offline experiences are not separated in the way that we would like them to be. And so a lot of my what I would love to see in terms of policy fixes is that, while it would be great to solve all these issues by regulating the internet, I don't know that these issues are issues that we can solve online, and actually they could be things that we instead look at providing more mental health counseling, that we think about what it means to provide spaces where kids can be, that we provide the type of support that parents or guardians need in order to ensure that kids can navigate the internet well. So I think that all being said, we definitely need to hold platforms accountable, so that will also be my final thing. So thank you.
No, thank you. So if you're in the audience and have questions, start thinking about them, because I'll probably turn it to you in about 15 minutes or so. But my first question for you all is, there seems to be we decided to go all in on a risk-based framework. We referenced a lot that should be a guidepost for how you think about sort of implementation for regulation for design features and whether or not to ban access to certain features. I am hearing on this panel a very different sort of risk assessments there, which may be an implication of the risk assessment framework generally. It's sort of in the eye of the beholder. So can I dive more in on like this, and I'll own that we stole it from like the age-appropriate design code because I thought it was smart. Can we dive more in on like a risk-based framework and like the pros and cons of it? Because I think that doesn't get discussed as much, and I'd love to like hear you all talk about that.
So I'll take privilege of being right next to you. There were a couple of things I was noting down as other folks were talking. I don't know the answer to this, but the thing about restricting content to some of the communities who need it the most, particularly LGBT teens, Supreme Court already decided that that was okay. There's at least 3 states that define sexual content as content about, I think what it is, homosexuals, lesbians, etc. And by the way, they also separate out sex acts. So it's just information about being gay. And so at this moment in time, as terrified as any of us are about it being weaponized, the vote is failed. And so what can we do to make it better? And I'm not sure. I have no idea. Until we get more post the Free Speech Coalition v. Paxton I don't think anyone knows. Or if somebody brings something against, like Kansas is one of the states that it's an antiquated definition of sexual content or conduct that all states had, with some rolling it back prior to this and many not. But we can force people to go through an age gate for that. That was very clear in the Supreme Court's decision. So I have that. The other thing with the risk, and I was taking a ton of notes and grabbing a bunch of stuff from some of the earlier panels, we don't know what's allowed with risks right now. There's a big open question from the Net Choice v. Bonta, the Age Appropriate Design Code one, not the other one, that where the Ninth Circuit said it wasn't okay because it clearly compels speech by requiring covered business to opine on potential harm to children, which triggers First Amendment scrutiny because it forces businesses to speak. I was less worried about the Ninth Circuit's decision there and more about the case that came right after it in oral arguments, which was Ex Court v. Bonta, where a law that said if, only if, you choose to have some sort of regulation about hate speech, you have to disclose how you define that. And the Ninth Circuit said that is unconstitutional. So they also tried to say, and consumer privacy laws are different, and here's some reasons why. Nobody quite knows what the boundaries of that is until we know. I think it's awfully hard to decide what the risk-based assessment should be because what could or could not be constitutional is all in the map right now.
Ariel and Matt, I'd actually love to turn to you because I think you both have very different instincts about what is or isn't risky and why and what harms. And I'd like to dive into it because I will note, as one of the authors, and Morgan can back me up, us drawing lines was hard. And I think we could have gone a couple different ways, and we didn't. And I want it, like, for the record of why this is hard. So if you both don't mind kind of diving into this more particularly, I would appreciate it.
Sure, I'm not sure, well, maybe there's less daylight than one might imagine, but probably more inclined to find more things to be high risk. I want to stress that common sense is not supported in general, sort of like content focused bans, not gotten involved in like age assurance for adult content, pornography, that kind of thing, at least in the US. I know it's weighed in on Online Safety Act and stuff in the UK. In general, I think what, I would think of as high risk would be, data collection of like your precise location or other highly sensitive personal information, if we think there's a distinction between sensitive and non-sensitive personal information. I think it's high risk to connect children with strangers in whatever form of communication that we are talking about. I think it's high risk to have them to connect children with an AI companion chatbot. I think it is medium or high risk to have sort of addictive features in platforms that ping you constantly overnight or that keep pushing you down different rabbit holes. It's not like you should be able to search for whatever you want and you're actively looking for something and you find it and that's great. That's different than being fed certain content or provided with certain rewards or being shown things to just keep picking up your phone, as Emma was talking about, in the middle of the night, and then like not even being able to open whatever Facebook said your friend posted, and from the email you have to actually log into the platform. This shows how old I am. But those kinds of things I think are medium or high risk. Certainly all of the virtual reality stuff, live streaming, things like that, things that you wouldn't want your child to do in person with strangers. don't want them to be capable of doing online, I guess, with strangers either. But you let them go to a library and look up whatever books or magazines they want, you know.
I think that my concern with risk-based is that when we're talking about regulations or laws, that those risks are set politically and not necessarily by experts and other folks. And because of that, there's just a lot of room for manipulating those risks towards a sort of political or cultural aim rather than a safety aim. And I think that throughout history we've seen a fixation on the idea that kids are sort of like the next version of whatever sort of cultural political movement that people who really care about that are involved in, and that there is a desire to shape their ideals and who they are. And I could just personally speak as coming from sort of a small conservative town, like I knew a lot of people who heard of a lot of people that were suppressed because they were different, because they were queer. I heard stories about friends of friends who were thrown out of their house at like 15, 16, and they had to live with friends until they were able to support themselves. And so I think a lot of this sort of warfare is continued now in these sort of policy spaces. I think that like on paper, risk-based sounds fairly common sense, but in practice it's almost impossible to do. And in a lot of ways, it's also very hard to shape blanket rules across all platforms, depending on sort of what they are, what capacity they are. You know, just going back to like age verification again, I know that there was some stories about Mastodon saying that like we literally just can't, like they are a federated collection of volunteer servers, run like at a cost loss in most cases. And like this is also one of the biggest incubation centers for like experiments in user sort of centered open source tools around moderation and other things like that. And so I think that there's just a lot of concern of unintended consequences here that really give me pause. And I wish that there was like an easy solution to all this stuff, but I haven't found one yet or seen one yet.
And I think actually some of what you're saying sort of supports a risk-based framework, because even all social media and all sites and services certainly are not all the same. And that's one thing that really sort of galls me when I hear like large social media companies talk about how age assurance is going to ruin anonymity online, and you don't have it online right now on their services. That's very different than sites that actually are not collecting information about users and don't actually know who their users are and are maintaining anonymity. And so I feel sort of, at least in terms of privacy risk perspective, like those two seem very different and seem like one size fits all is not a great fit there.
Yeah, and I do want to clarify, I don't want any of my comments to be seen as defending big tech. I think that they've clearly, in report after report, caused a lot of harm and centered profits rather than users in their choices.
I'll say the same thing as Matt. It's just a general disclaimer, because this is a weird thing about talking about some of these things. Sometimes is people think that you really like Facebook, and I do not. But that's cool. The legal side, well, I think I like what Matt said, and around really listening to the experts. There are experts who study this. There are risks. I think a lot of the time when we think about risk, we think about what is the most extreme thing that can happen, but it's actually really statistically unlikely to happen. And so we actually need to center that. I am very scared of snakes, but I actually have seen 2 in DC if anyone wants to keep track with me. The animals, but so anyways, so I actually think that's a healthy here. But anyways, but there are actually there are things that people are very concerned about that we think are very risky, but they might not actually be that risky or that common. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So actually, also I really liked what you said, Ariel, about the sleep sleep is actually one of the things that social media really disrupts. It's actually, there's a lot of research that shows that it's terrible for young people, and if young people really need sleep while they're developing, we all need some more sleep than we probably get, maybe not everyone, but I'll speak for myself. But that's something that there's not enough to focus on because sleep is not seen as a particularly interesting thing. So when I think about a risk-based framework, the way I actually really think about it more is regulating for impact. So what's the impact that you're trying to have, and what's the kind of positive world that you're trying to build, and then kind of backtrack on that. And so if the positive thing that we're trying to build is preventing some of the worst harms, absolutely, but also preserving a world where people can explore, can learn online, can connect with people, how do you build for that? And I think that a risk-based one is actually a slightly, I often think of it as a deficit mindset as opposed to what's the kind of positive angle of this, and that's not to say that all things in tech are positive, but that's just kind of how I approach it.
So, want to jump in. This is fun. You guys should just hang out. In general, we'll just talk about all this stuff. We're all geeks up here. So there are a couple things that made me think about. First of all is, what is the definition that we're talking about of the entity we're regulating? Because almost all the laws say that it's social media, and it's not. It is very rarely limited to social media. It is generally, depending on the state or federal version, platforms that allow users to interact with others broadly, which is why you get something like the Online Safety Act blocking access to Reddit forums on Gaza or sexual assault survivors, or other things, because as much as I think people are looking at regulating big tech, it ends up being regulating a much broader swath, dramatically broader swath of the internet than people mean it to. But of course, the hard thing with that is you can have small companies that do incredibly bad things. Character AI was 2 people. And so the answer isn't exempt the tiny ones and overdo, well, the overdo and the big ones is maybe warranted at this point, but how do we make sure that in our laws we're being nuanced about the types of sites that we're trying to regulate? And I think in some ways that's easy to do because the bar is so low. I love to read FTC complaints. It's really fun. I also teach privacy law at William & Mary Law School, which is part of it. But I invite people to read, say, the Epic Games settlement, among others. It's actually pretty fun. They have a lot of screenshots in there. It is the most horrifying. Anyone could tell you that if you put a bunch of people into a live voice situation, there are going to be a bunch of bad things that kids are hearing and dealing with. Anyone. And that wasn't fixed for years. We're not talking about some of these nuanced areas. We're talking about really baseline, somebody reports really horrible thing and nothing is done. Somebody just wants a button or a filter and can show that there have been life-changing consequences, and nothing has been done. The other thing I'll say is just, I agree about being careful about child privacy and child safety being used as a mask over other agendas. There's this fascinating dialogue in one of the cases, the various net choice cases that are challenging a lot of these laws, where you had the state give this example of, we don't allow kids in bars in the mall, and the judge asked, so in this example, you would allow the kid in the mall and they just couldn't go in the bar, and they said no, the kid shouldn't be able to go in the mall. There are definitely other agendas at play and limitations and blindfolds that sometimes people understandably want to put on the people they love, on their kids, that that aren't as, not substantive, but aren't key to the conversation are really about safety and privacy. And so remembering that and incorporating that is really important.
Thank you. Well, I want to just check into the audience if there's any questions. If not, I can keep going. I find these people very interesting. Oh, yeah, so many. All right, I'm going to start with Pam, and then I'll go to the person in plaid whose name I can't see. So Pam.
Yeah, so I think everybody is saying wonderful things, and that the path forward is to lead to this actionable, feasible regulation. Oh, and here's the microphone. Thank you. I was using my teacher voice. But the question I have is more the path beyond the path forward, because the U.S. has always lagged behind these types of regulations. We're not part of GDPR. And one of the interesting reports that I saw coming out of GDPR after it was implemented is that it's not been enforced. And so there is this very large privacy framework and protection plan and regulation. But then I heard, and I'm not one of the regulation people, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, that one of the problems with it is that even though it exists, it's still not being enforced in a way that helps people. And do you see that once we have these types of regulations in place to protect kids online, that will fall into the similar trap of like, okay, well, it's been regulated, it's still not being actually enforced?
So, if I think really quick, I often hear about the not being enforced, and certainly there are plenty of examples if you Google NOYB, great organization in the EU that will track where there hasn't been sufficient enforcement of the GDPR, but oh my God, there's so much enforcement of the GDPR. If you go to the Data Protection Commission Irish site, they have case studies upon case studies upon case studies. I think a lot of people get annoyed when there isn't enforcement quickly or when there's only 30 cases being done in a year. When it's compared, first of all, to us, but more broadly, it means a lot more. And there's this great report that I have here from Children and Screens on the impact just since 2022 of the UK Age Appropriate Design Code. It's a 36-page report, definitely worth a read. And it goes through piece by piece of all of the changes that just the major companies, not the smaller ones, just the major companies made in the space of, I think this came out a year and a half ago, so about 2 years. Stuff that people said was impossible to do. And yet they're doing it. So there's definitely, we're never going to get to a point where people are happy about enforcement, but is there any area of the law where we're super happy about enforcement? Not really. And I think privacy isn't an exception to that, but there's a lot more happening than people know.
I was just gonna say, like, I think in the US, we have like under and over enforcement of laws because you have what seem like a lot of like the hot coffee McDonald's, plaintiffs' lawsuits, and then on the flip side, you have a lot of these laws getting passed where there's no private right of action and it's only regulator or attorney general enforcement, and that's sort of the compromise to get like the state privacy law passed. And then the regulator gets enough money to pay for like half an additional attorney for the whole law, and those laws are not getting enforced. But like I think we're seeing more. We're seeing California's obviously doing stuff, Texas has money to do stuff, that's been really interesting to watch. So there is more enforcement, but I think, and this goes to the private right of action in the paper, you need to have effective enforcement, whether it's gonna be a well-funded expert regulator or reasonable lawsuits, and sometimes the US has neither.
I would just add that there's a number of reasons why we are not big fans of content regulation, but like enforceability is among them. I think when it comes to privacy or user tools or other things that give people control, that's obviously easier to enforce. If folks, really care about this, I definitely recommend going to TrustCon or talking to a content moderator. I had a colleague who used to be a content moderator, and her team was the one that dealt with complaints around Napalm Pearl, which is a very, very famous photojournalistic I don't know if everybody Vietnam, of a young girl who was completely naked because she had just been covered in napalm, and so it kind of fit into a number of like bad content, but also necessary content. And I can't imagine the government being involved in the decision of whether to leave that up or take it down would really help the situation. It was already extremely difficult, and they made a choice one way and got yelled at, and then they put the photo back up.
Can I pass it to you? Yeah.
Yeah, Jerry Case, research engineer here in DC. I was curious on the panel, I love numbers. What do you think would be not perfect kind of a profile for an individual? We're looking, parents are looking for a compass, young adults moving to metropolitan cities looking for a compass. It's like offline, online ratio, how much people should be digitally connected versus non-digitally in the analog world. Like what you just say is a good 50, 40, 40, 30, 70, 20. And I think people are really, I think what would help these frameworks is as we say, we're not trying to build the perfect robot or human, but at least people knowing, all right, I'm getting 40%, 50% on a good day, bad day. You know, what numbers would look good in terms of analog versus digital connection?
This is where I really like your 5-minute break. I don't know about every hour because it would drive me nuts, but having a pause point allows you to consciously decide if you want to keep going, because so many people feel compelled to just stay and keep going.
Yeah, I will say as a lawyer, I am allergic to numbers or putting numbers on anything, so that just made me break out into hives. But yeah, I think it is more we have been seeing from qualitative research, kids feeling like they didn't have like the ability to stop, and what tools could you give that makes it easier to stop. And I think the reason I am loath to put on like what digital versus analog should be is just like working. I am in some way connected to some sort of internet protocol, basically the entire time I'm awake to do my job. And that's another very different conversation. But I am loath to try to artificially deflate numbers for kids because so much stuff just happens online. So I don't know that public knowledge would ever come out with like a here's the goal. But our signpost for this was kids stating over and over in different studies that they don't feel like they can easily disconnect. And that to me was an interesting thing to try to like facilitate. And I don't know if we got it right, but that is something that stuck when we were looking at the research. But
No, I think that's do you guys know about Cocomelon? I've not watched it, but know about it, right? Okay, apparently everyone does. But it's designed to keep you watching because they've searched all the different search words that kids were looking for, so therefore they're like, and they built a TV show around what are the things that are most addictive to kids, which maybe seems self-evident, but I was like, wow, that's really evil. And genius, I'm evil geniuses, but I haven't watched it. But I think that's like the idea there. I don't know that there's a specific number. I think everyone's different. Like Sara, also I hate how much I'm on my computer every day, but also it is my job, and when I'm on vacation, I'm not on my computer as much because I'm outside doing other things. I like my relationships with people in person, but also most of my family lives halfway around the world from me, so I spend a lot of time on the phone with them. I just think it depends, and I don't think there's like a specific parameter, but I think that we can think about what is healthy for these individual people, and then how do we introduce that type of friction that allows people to make those choices. So maybe it is having a pause point, maybe it is having some thoughtful design around not allowing YouTube to stream these really addictive shows, whatever that looks like.
I would agree with all that. I would also just say that, if we're looking for a wedge, I think a good target point is sort of dealing with the incentives created by our surveillance capitalism and our sort of advertised-based online model, where all the incentives are to keep people online and looking at ads as much as possible and having hyper-targeted ads that are built on just enormous volumes of information that are being collected on you. And to the extent that we can sort of break that model, it would be a lot healthier.
I see Ian raised his hand, and then I think Jim had a question.
Mine was a follow-up to this one.
Okay.
Just a brief comment and connection to Adam's one. Coming from the education side, I feel this resonates to me in the conversations that we've had in the school space for the last couple of years around screen time limits. The conversations there have been much more kind of highlighting quality of screen time versus quantity of screen time, and that's going to be different depending on the context. The other piece that resonates for me on this one is not just the idea of amount of time, but time of day, and bringing up things like screen time curfews. That may differ from country to country. It also may differ based on the life situation of the teen, that may be working late hours or having family responsibilities. So kind of two things to add to the conversation when we think about quantity versus quality.
Thank you. And I think like American Academy of Pediatrics has recommendations for children at least of screen time, but I was like plus 100 to what you're doing on the screen is really important for how much you should be on it.
Are you happy with the amount of time? Because if you're not, then there's some level of self-control, and by self-control I mean the features that were created to keep you online. And for the moment that means to regulate it, we have to introduce our own friction, which sucks, but happy to talk about how to do that. It's fun.
Thanks. Ian Corby from the Age Verification Providers Association. And I'm going to resist the right, or demanding the right for a sort of response on age verification, but just to re-emphasise, it's supposed to be anonymous and we don't keep your data. But I'll talk about that over drinks. What I was really interested in was the paper, and because when I read it over lunch, it struck me that it's entirely aligned with the principles and the approach in the UK's Online Safety Act, which is in itself sort of closely associated with the Age-Appropriate Design Code. And actually, I just asked ChatGPT and Grok and Gemini the same question, and all three of them are unanimous that says that the answer you came up with is effectively identical to the UK's Online Safety Act. So I wasn't sure if that was accidental or intentional.
So I will quibble that I say a lot in the paper, and when I was talking that like we explicitly don't want content restrictions, and like there is in this framework there is no such thing as harmful content, and that was really important to me. And while the Online Safety Act doesn't designate certain content as harmful, it does allow for much more content-based restrictions that I don't think, and I was hoping was coming across in the paper, that was intended for here. Like this was really meant to be sort of a design privacy feature requirement outline rather than something like that, both because of the First Amendment, but also I think our legal director has talked about it a lot. Like content is problematic because no one piece of content is probably going to cause you harm. It's like mass quantity and other things. So getting out of that lens and going somewhere else is somewhere we were really trying to focus on. So I guess I will quibble. But I have experts here. Maybe I was wrong.
I agree.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, except that pornography is now especially harmful. So high risk.
It's short. I mean, pornography is also not considered speech in the US, so I was okay.
I mean, maybe I'm just looking at the sentence. Maybe that's what the like.
Okay.
You know.
Yeah.
The ChatGPT was picking up on. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, the Online Safety Act actually picks out pornography and stuff that helps you to kill yourself or harm yourself or starve yourself. That's the only strictly content-based aspect of it.
I think the nuance there that we're getting into a little bit is how you tell the difference between seeking help and seeking harmful content. And that's where I have appreciated in the US, and generally speaking, I love the age-appropriate design code. I'll stick it in our line in a second, but I like the fact that we acknowledge that users are going to independently look something up, and that is not something that in the US, according to current constitutional principles, that can be stopped. You have the proactive ability. I think the big issue, which I'm sure Online Safety Act was also trying to deal with, wasn't that people were looking things up, it's that it was being shoved in their face. And so there's almost this imbalance now happening, which I'm sure will result in the pendulum swinging the other way as everybody gets mad about the Online Safety Act. So, yeah, I think you can't just shut out a type of content because someone generally says it's harmful. Only because historically, what's considered harmful 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago is now stuff that is part of people's lives and we recognized as civil rights issues.
Can I just quickly, so I have spent a lot of time in the UK in the last 5 years, so I go back and forth between there and there. So I find the Online Safety Act quite interesting. Well, that's not what, but have experienced it in person, and I just think the UK is a really different context too, and so I don't know that it's perfectly aligned with this paper, but I also think that some of the things that you all are doing are feasible there because you do have a specific type of ID that you can use. You do have some of the infrastructure there. Not everyone does, but more people have IDs there than they do in the US, and so there are things that you can do there. The speech requirements are different than what they are in the US, and so I think that you can operate it. I don't necessarily agree with all parts of it. I do think that it has meant that some people have lost access to some of their, some of the information that they looked at freely before, which is different, but that's like by the by. But I don't know that everything that was laid out in here would necessarily cause the same things, because I think that what a lot of the Online Safety Act has done, which is interesting, and I'm quite interested in it generally, is we are going to say that these things are harmful. We are going to figure out a way to allow us to achieve the end goal that we want. So I think like the end-to-end encryption one was something that came up a lot of. There was how you do the message content moderation without ending end-to-end encryption. That was kind of like, we'll figure it out after the fact, right? Like we're going to do this, but we'll figure it out after. And I think it's a different reality there than here, and I don't know that everything that was laid out in the paper would necessarily translate in the same way. I don't know. That's just my general sense.
One quick vignette just to add. We now have a First Amendment in the UK because Section 22 of the Online Safety Act introduces for the very first time a duty to protect freedom of expression.
I just have one comment, and that is, I think we care a lot about getting this right, and specifically we spend a lot of time trying to challenge a lot of the harms of big tech in an effective way. And one of the problems that we sort of noticed was that the UK Online Safety Act was incredibly unpopular. It was so unpopular that like our traffic went up by quite a bit afterwards, and we had to figure out why. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because when you make mistakes and you have too many unintended consequences or too much friction in a way that users hate, you make it politically unpopular to then fix and do the right thing. And so, I came from an interest background, so just a quick example there. One of the sort of the bogeymen in interest was there was a period of time in which the president was adamant in doing this interest case against cereal companies, and it was like insanely unpopular. And I think for like a decade after, it was like politically hard to prosecute antitrust cases, just based on like the president that won one of his platforms was we're going to kill this investigation.
One other thing I'll add, just because apparently all of us are geeks about the Online Safety Act, there's been a call recently by some of the folks who pushed for it to say, oh, let's now ban VPNs because people are using VPNs to go around it, which of course, technologically, other things, I think some people think there's an easy button. Many of those people, I think, were born before the internet. And there's not. As anyone who works on any sort of content moderation, any sort of policy issue, it's whack-a-mole. And it's always going to be whack-a-mole. So how do we control? How do we put guardrails? How do we make sure that people are held accountable for the rules we have? Put in place new rules as we need them. But the idea of just shutting off swaths of content or tolerating really bad age verification in some cases, and I'll note that there are really good ones too, Yodi, et cetera, who've been looking at the impacts on marginalized communities, for example, for years. But there are also those who get fooled by a Barbie doll. So yeah, really thinking about those consequences, and that is where I think First Amendment here is incredibly important. We'll see exactly whether that gets interpreted in different ways over the next decade by the court.
I think there is one more hand in the back, and I'm going to close it at the last question. So I'd like to.
There's two hands in the back, I think.
Oh, okay. Whoops, I didn't see one.
Hi everyone, thank you. This is Amelia, Center for Democracy and Technology. So I had a couple of questions, but I think that's cheating. But the first is I just wanted clarification on one of the policy questions that was on the slide earlier, which was, I think the third one was like, what is sufficient age assurance? And I'd love a little bit of like, just clarity around how you're thinking about sufficiency. I asked that because CDT is thinking a little bit about what, how age assurance, what does it look like to do age assurance in a privacy and rights respecting way. Asterisks, it's sort of difficult and impossible, but the frame we've been using is proportionality, and so wondering if that's sort of whether there's overlaps there. And then a larger macro question, the second part of my questions, is like what stops us from recommending some of the tools, child safety tools, user control tools that we're thinking, we've mentioned here, like reporting, blocking, nudges on screen time, algorithmic controls, etc., to all users? Why are we trying to only offer them to children? I'd love to hear your thoughts. I think one of the panelists sort of alluded to maybe the friction being irritating after a while, like is it just convenience and user-friendliness? And I ask that because number one, we've surveyed and spoken with 45 parents and teenagers and about what they think about commonly proposed policy interventions and technical interventions. And overwhelmingly, when we ask a teenager, oh, like, would you like a nudge that says, go to bed now? Sometimes, I mean, they have a lot of views, sometimes mixed, but a lot of times the parents in the room are like, we'd like that too, right? Like, I think we also have our own sort of, fraught is not the right word, but I'll just use it here for brevity, but like relationships with these social media services. So I think we're moving in a paradigm where a lot of the legislation is coming from frustration writ large with social media, and then we're trying to cram it into a child safety veneer. But a lot of the user controls could be offered to all users. And then I just wanted to, those are the questions. I'll just give a +1 on like, sort of like my take or of how I think tools are deployed in a way that are actually useful. The Irish digital service coordinator that's tasked with enforcing parts of the DSA, the Digital Services Act, has, as part of their enforcement of Article 28, protection of minors, has developed curriculum and like modules for introducing young people to what tools exist to control their own online information environment. So just a plus for any tools that we will be rolling out for whoever will require a lot of boots on the ground. And this idea of like online legislation not having offline paradigms is gonna, not really go the mile, go the extra, the last mile. I have 2 questions in there.
So Alia, I'm going to take moderator's privilege and say I will answer your question over drinks. Because I think it's a longer discussion, but very similar to proportionality, but slightly different with how we decided, that's maybe kind of boring. I'm sure Matt can talk about whether or not this was a good policy decision, and I'm happy to push back. That at least I would like to influence the kids stuff that we get to be good. That was an explicit, I didn't make it explicit in the paper because that felt crass, but that is the political reality we're in, and that's why I did it. But I'm happy to turn it to you all if you agree with me, if you don't, all of that good stuff.
So,
that's right.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I hate to say it, but like as a harm reduction manner, I'd rather a good kids bill be passed than a bad one, especially one that respects, a lot of these issues that we care about. But I do agree that I think these problems are universal, and the more that we can address them universally, just in a world in which that could happen, the less we have to worry about segregating kids or all of the sort of other issues that come with age verification.
And also, like, if kids are, I mean, if kids are a third of the people online, if we have better online regulations for everyone, the kids would also be better.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I also think that, to your point, Sarah, that you need, if you have the default features for everyone already be privacy protective or security protective, then to Matt's point and Ariel's point as well, everyone's point, and we're all saying the same thing, then it sets it for everyone, right? So I think those are good things to have. And then at the very least, then you have to turn those features off, which would be the world that I would like to live in.
I think there was one more question.
Hi, this is Maxwell from First Focus on Children. I just wanted to say something that really resonated with me was the empowerment angle, because even in my own experience, I think Pinterest is the only social media I use, and they've removed the, like, please don't show me this button. So I've experienced being depowered in social media spaces, even as an adult. But one thing, because I'm not an academic, I wanted to ask all about is when you talk about the data that you want from platforms to be able to do more research, like what is that? What questions do you want to be able to ask, and like what is there that you would want to know?
So many things that we want to know, but I think the idea, so the type of data that you need to be able to access is some type of de-identified data. I think Wikipedia had some really interesting ways in which they use differential privacy to share user data about specific people while still making sure that it was privacy protective. So something like that. Longitudinal data where you can actually look at what these features are and you can track them over time. I would love to be able to do RCTs on all these things, but without that, or maybe we have some like randomized control trials that actually the platforms do themselves, but there's an independent audit to be able to look at it. In terms of the specific question, I'm sorry to always, it depends, like it just depends on the platform, it depends on what you're trying to measure. I am a big believer that you don't start with, you start with the question and then you kind of backtrack on the data. It's how I used to approach things. A lot of times you don't get to do that, but in an ideal world, good. So happy to chat about that more, but and I'm sorry about Pinterest.
I'll give an example of recent research, which I was over the moon to see. CoPlab put out a report that was specifically about LGBT individuals in rural communities, which is not generally what is looked at with these issues. And I mean, it's that sort of thing where we're not thinking about the stereotypical kid, the stereotypical LGBT kid, the stereotypical, et cetera, like looking genuinely at different populations to see how this impacts them. I could not find it. So if you remember the report, there's this amazing Common Sense Media report from last year that found that if you have moderate depression, social media is actually good for you. Like, it actually improves your sense of community, the fact that you're not the only one who feels like this. This really is nuanced, and getting that nuance in front of people so we know how to target all of this is incredibly important.
As you can tell, we probably could keep talking about this for a while, but I don't want to stop you from having some refreshments, seeing the beautiful view, and thanking you all for taking time out of your day to come and launch this paper with public knowledge. We're going to be continuing to work on this beat. Happy to meet you all and talk more over drinks, but again, this has been a wonderful day, and